Introduction to the Old Testament, Part 2, and this is the last days of David from 2 Samuel, and the first part of 1 Kings, the rule of Solomon. Then chapter 23 begins the last words of David, and since this really is connected with Solomon, we need to deal with it now. These are the last words of David. The oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the Lord of Jacob, Israel's singer of songs. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me, when one rules over men in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise on the cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings the grass from the earth. Is not my house right with God? Has he not made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part? Will he not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire? But evil men are all to be cast aside like thorns, which are not gathered with the hand. Whoever touches thorns uses a tool of iron or the shaft of a spear. They are burned up where they lie. So he is contrasting the blessing of God and then evil men who are burned up with fire. In the rest of chapter 23, we have David's mighty men. Now these are listed in detail. Some of them are very prominent, such as the three. We have the names of David's mighty men in verse 8. Josheb-Boshebeth, a Tachmonite, chief of the three. He raised his spear against 800 men, whom he killed in one encounter. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai, the Alohite. As one of the three mighty men, he was with David when they taunted the Philistines gathered at Pas-Damim for battle. Then the men of Israel retreated, but he stood his ground and struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Now Eleazar had taken care of all of the rest of them. And then in verse 11, next to him was Shammah, son of Agi, the Hararite. When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them. But Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. These are men that are described as the three. They have done great deeds, but we don't read about their deeds in the regular text. Now we'll leave the list of men in chapter 23 and go on to the census that David takes in chapter 24. This is a sin of David. David was not supposed to number the people. But it says the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go and count Israel and Judah. Now here we can make a little distinction between the book of 2 Samuel and the book of Chronicles. In Chronicles, it says that Satan enticed David to do this. Here in Samuel, it says that God incited David to count the men. Joab didn't want to do this. but the king's command prevailed. In verse 5, after crossing the Jordan, they camped near Aroer, south of the town in the gorge, and then went through Gad and on to Jazer. They went to Gilead and the region of Tatim Hodshai, and on to Dan Ya'an, and around toward Sidon. It tells where they went. And they numbered all of the men of Judah. Joab, in verse 9, reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah 500,000. You notice that already there is a distinction made between the northern tribes and the tribe of Judah, which has Simeon as part of it. And then David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And again we have one of the prophets, this time Gad, went to David and gave him a choice of 3 punishments. This is in verse 13. Shall there be 3 years of famine in the land, 3 months of fleeing before your enemies, 3 days of plague in the land? So David chose the Lord, the 3 days of plague. Verse 15, the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. Now that's a lot of people dying because of the indiscretion of David. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. Now David is at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, and he wants to buy the threshing floor as a place to offer his sacrifice. He refuses the gift of this threshing floor from Araunah and pays for it. He pays the full price. In verse 24, the king replied to Araunah, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. Now it is here at the threshing floor of Araunah that the temple is built. So this is a very important part, a land that David purchased from Araunah. Now let's move to 1 Kings, and this talks about the very last days of David. It says the king was old, well advanced in years. And I'm not sure why they use this formula, but they do it so many times. They did it with Moses, they did it with Aaron, they did it with Joshua. They are old and well advanced in years. If you just said old, they were old. But this is the way they express it. And he could not keep himself warm even when they put covers on him. So what they are going to do is to find a young virgin to attend the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our Lord the King may keep warm. Now this young virgin is not going to be able to keep him warm either. What it is going to tell us is that King David is impotent and he can no longer serve as king, because we are told that he had no intimate relations with her. Well, if he is old and he is no longer fit to rule, then his sons are going to decide they are in line to inherit the throne. And Adonijah in verse 5 does this. He put himself forward and said, I will be king. So he got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. Now this is what Absalom had done. He got 50 men to run ahead of him. Now this is what Adonijah does. And it says that his father had never interfered with him by asking, why do you behave as you do? Now this is one of the difficulties with David. He never corrects his sons. They are not brought up properly. They have not received correction. And it says he was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. Now we know that Amnon was killed by Absalom. Absalom was killed by Joab. So the third person in line is Adonijah. So Adonijah goes to Joab, son of Zeruiah. He's an important person. Abiathar the priest, and they gave him support. But in verse 8, Zadok the priest, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei and Rei, and David's special guard did not join Adonijah. So here we are told about two groups of people, both groups wanting to be king. Adonijah sacrificed sheep, cattle, fattened calves at the stone of Zohelet near Ein Rogel. He invited all his brothers and king's sons and all the men of Judah who were royal officials. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah or the special guard or his brother Solomon. When Nathan recognizes what is happening, he goes to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and asks, have you not heard that Adonijah the son of Haggith has become king without our Lord David's knowing it? Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go to the king and say to him, my lord the king, did you not swear to me, your servant, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Now while you're speaking to the king, I will come in and I will verify what you have said. So Bathsheba did this. She says in verse 17, my Lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it. He has sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves and sheep, invited all the king's sons, Abiathar the priest and Joab the commander of the army, but he has not invited Solomon your servant. So she wants to know what he's going to do about it. In verse 22, while she was still speaking, Nathan the prophet arrived, and they told the king, Nathan the prophet is here. So he went before the king and bowed with his face to the ground. And Nathan says, have you, my lord the king, declared that Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will sit on your throne? And then he tells what Adonijah has done. Then David called in Bathsheba and says, I will carry out today what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place. Now Solomon is probably a lot younger than Adonijah. Then Bathsheba bowed low, and that says, may my Lord King David live forever. But he's just about ready to croak. And King David said, call in Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada. And then he tells them, take Solomon my son, have him ride on my own mule, and take him to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, long live King Solomon. And then he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. So this is what they did. In verse 38, Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites, and the Pelethites went down and put Solomon on King David's mule and escorted him to Gihon. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, long live King Solomon. And all the people went after him, playing flutes and rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with the sound. Now those who were with Adonijah heard the sound and was wondering what was going on. And we're told that Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, arrived, and he told them, Solomon has been made king. So all of those who are with Adonijah sneak away. They don't want to be caught with Adonijah. In verse 49, at this all Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed. But Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon was told, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon and is clinging to the horns of the altar. Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. So Solomon says if he behaves himself, everything will be fine. Chapter 2, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. His charge involves positive things and negative things. First, he wants him to adhere to the law of God. Make sure you do what is right. And then in verse 5, you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle, and with that blood stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. So let him alone, but be sure he dies violently. And then he is to show kindness to Barzillai, the Gileadite, and then Shimei, remember that son of Gera, the Benjamite, who cursed David when he was fleeing from Jerusalem, and then went to meet him across the Jordan and ask forgiveness. And David wouldn't allow anything to be done to him. But now he tells Solomon, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Now Solomon, with his regime, is stronger than David was. And this is why David tells him to take care of Joab and take care of Shimei. Now Adonijah then went to Bathsheba to ask a request. He would like to marry this young virgin that had been brought to David. And Bathsheba thought this was a good idea. So she went to Solomon to ask him if he would allow Adonijah to marry her. This is not the way in which Solomon saw it. In verse 21 of chapter 2, the request is made, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah." King Solomon answered his mother, "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar the priest and Joab son of Zeruiah." Now, if Adonijah is able to marry Abishag, she is a widow of King David, and then that gives him a legitimate reason for taking over the throne. Adonijah then is killed. In verse 25, Solomon gave orders to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He struck down Adonijah, and he died. To Abiathar the priest, he tells him that he is exiled to Anathoth, and he's not going to die because he served David with the Ark of the Covenant. Abiathar then is removed from being a priest. The word of the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli, and that's when the whole family of Eli would be terminated. And this fulfills that promise, because Abiathar was from the line of Eli. And when Joab heard what had been done, he went to the altar and took hold of the horns. And King Solomon was told that he was there. And it says that Solomon ordered Benaiah, "Go strike him down." But Joab says, "No, I won't leave here." So Solomon tells Benaiah, "Go in and kill him where he is holding the horns of the altar." So that took care then of Adonijah. It took care of Joab. It took care of Abiathar. And the only one left now is Shimei. In verse 36, the king sent for Shimei and said to him, "Build your house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. The day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, you can be sure you will die. Your blood will be on your own head." So Shimei says that's what he will do. That's fine. But then in verse 39, 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran off to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. And Shimei was told, "Your slaves are in Gath." And so he went to Gath to reclaim his slaves. But in doing so, he had to cross the valley of Kidron. And so when he returned, he's met by Solomon. Verse 46, the king gave the order to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down and killed him. The kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hands. So all of the requests of David have been fulfilled. Now Solomon, when he becomes king, seems to be a very humble person and is dedicated to the Lord. And Solomon has a vision of the Lord, or a dream from the Lord, and the Lord asks him, "What do you want?" And Solomon asks for wisdom, because this people is numerous, they are great, and he needs help in governing the people. So God answers him in verse 10 of chapter 3. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And then there is a caution in verse 14. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. Now, what is said here is very important, because you'll find that when they start describing the kings and whether they are good or bad, in the northern kingdom, they always ask, did they follow the way of Jeroboam? And in the southern kingdom, they always ask, was he like David? So if you perform as David did and follow the Lord, you are a good king. That is a standard by which all of them will be measured. Now, since God had given wisdom to Solomon, we have an example of this. There are two prostitutes that came to the king, and they were arguing about a son that was born. Both of them had given birth to a son, but the one had lain on the son and killed him during the night. And so when she saw that her son was dead, she put the dead son in the bed with the other woman and took the live son and put him in her own bed. Now they are coming to King Solomon for him to decide which one gets the son. And he does a very good thing. When he hears the argument from each of them and recognizes that both claim they have the live son and the other woman has the dead son, he says, okay, bring me a sword. We'll cut this baby in half and give half to each. This is when the mother comes out. She says, no, give the child to the other woman. And then Solomon says, as she is the mother, give the child to her. And then we read about Solomon's officials and his governors. The administration requires more individuals than we had during the time of David. And we have Azariah, son of Zadok, is the priest. This is in chapter 4. Elihoreph and Ahijah, sons of Shishai, the secretaries. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, the recorder. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, commander-in-chief. Zadok and Abiathar, priests. Azariah, son of Nathan, in charge of the district officers. Now that's a new office that we hadn't seen before. And Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest and personal advisor to the king. Abishar, in charge of the palace. And Adoniram, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor. And then we are also told that Solomon had 12 districts. Before, everything was done according to tribal boundaries. But now, Solomon appoints 12 districts. And each of these districts is responsible for the upkeep of the palace 1 month of the year. And these are named from chapter 4, verse 8 through verse 19. And some of these are actually relatives of Solomon. Abinadab, in verse 11, who was married to Tapheth, daughter of Solomon. Verse 15, Ahimaaz, he had married Basemath, daughter of Solomon. So we have 12 districts. And you'll notice that there is nothing in Judah. All of these 12 districts are in the northern tribes, in the northern kingdom. And the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And it says that Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river, and this would be the Euphrates River, to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon actually ruled over the territory that God had told Moses, from the river Euphrates to the river of Egypt, and from the Mediterranean to the desert. And we are told what the provision was for Solomon's house. In verse 22, Solomon's daily provisions: 30 cores of fine flour, and a core as given as 6.6 kiloliters, 185 bushels of fine flour, and 375 bushels of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the river, from Tirzah to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. And we are told that the district officers had to provide everything needed for the king for 1 month of the year. They brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses. So it's not only what they ate in the king's house, but also for the animals as well. In verse 29 of chapter 4, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the east, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Dirda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. Then we have preparations for building the temple. Remember earlier, David wanted to build a temple, and God says, no, you can't do it. But I'm going to build a house for you, a dynasty. Now, Solomon, his son, is going to build the temple. Hiram kept King Solomon supplied with all the cedar and pine logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Now, the area of the coastal plain, Sidon and Tyre, those cities were very wealthy because of their sea trade, but they didn't have room for growing crops, so they are dependent upon others. And Israel was one of the main groups that supplied the food that was needed for the Phoenicians. In verse 13 of chapter 5, King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men, spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home, and they are responsible for cutting the timber and shipping it to Israel. There were also 3,300 foremen and 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hills. So you have a huge number of craftsmen who are working. Now, all of these may be foreigners, but they may be conscripted from Israel as well. In chapter 6, that in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. And we are told about the dimensions, how they built it, what is the material that is used in the building. They usually had 3 layers of stone and then 1 layer of wood. And this kept it in good condition, especially when you have earthquakes. It is much easier to preserve the building if you have the wood in between the stone. So this was built for that purpose. And then it tells about all of the decorations and who it was that did this work. In verse 37 of chapter 6, the foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished. So it's a little over 7 years in the building process. And then Solomon also built a palace for himself, and that took 13 years. And so you have 20 years that are used for the building of his palace and temple. We're also told how he built his palace in chapter 7, 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams, roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 14 to a row. Windows were placed high in sets of 3 facing each other. And then it tells about the doorways and how they were constructed. And all of this was of the finest material. In verse 13 of chapter 7, it says that King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was a man of Tyre and a craftsman in bronze. Huram was highly skilled and experienced in all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. And it tells what were the bronze items that he made. And these are in chapter 7. And then you have in chapter 8, the ark is brought to the temple. In chapter 8, verse 22, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, and he has a lengthy prayer that he prays, and part of this is very applicable even today. In verse 41, as for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for men will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. And then he also mentions that when the people sin that if they will do the right thing, God will listen to them. In verse 46, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to the enemy who takes them captive to his own land, far away or near, and if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent, and plead with you in the land of their conquerors, and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, we have acted wickedly, and they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their fathers, toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for you. Forgive your people who have sinned against you. Forgive all the offenses they have committed against you, and cause their conquerors to show them mercy. For they are your people and your inheritance, whom you brought out of Egypt, out of that iron smelting furnace. So after his prayer, there is a dedication then of the temple, and that begins in chapter 8, verse 42. 32,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats were sacrificed. Then the Lord appears to Solomon a second time in chapter 9, and he says, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. And then there are other activities of Solomon that are mentioned in chapter 9, beginning with verse 10. And then in chapter 10, we have the visit of the Queen of Sheba. She visits Solomon. She brings a large retinue with her. She has large quantities of spices, gold, precious stones, with camels bearing all of these. When she saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. And she makes the comment that I had heard about your achievements and your wisdom. It's true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw it with my own eyes. Even half was not told me. She gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And then we're mentioned that there were ships of Hiram that went from Ophir, and from there they brought great cargoes of almug wood and precious stones. And the king used the almug wood to make supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps and lyres for the musicians. And King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. The splendor of Solomon is mentioned again, and it mentions in verse 23, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses, which he was not supposed to do. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kui. The royal merchants purchased them from Kui. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. So he was carrying on a very lucrative trade with all of the kingdoms around him. Now we're told about Solomon's wives, and this is not a good thing. It says that he loved many foreign women. This is in chapter 11. Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them." He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. His wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. He also built shrines for some of these gods on the east of Jerusalem. He burned incense and offered sacrifices to the gods of his wives. And it says that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." And then we're told about the adversaries of Solomon. One is Hadad the Edomite. He, along with some of his officials, fled to Egypt. Pharaoh was pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Taphanes, in marriage, and she bore him a son named Genubath, whom Taphanes brought up in the royal palace. And then God raised up against Solomon another adversary. This is in chapter 11, verse 23. Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. He gathered men around him and became a leader of a band of rebels. When David destroyed the forces of Zobah, the rebels went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. The main rebel is going to be Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He rebelled against the king, and his story is told in chapter 11, beginning with verse 26. Verse 29, about that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new robe. And the prophet then took his new robe, tore it into 12 pieces and gave 10 of them to Jeroboam, and said he would rule over 10 tribes. So Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and he stayed there until Solomon's death. And then for the other events of Solomon's reign, everything he did, the wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? It says Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king.